Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK's ongoing series of discussions on the situation, the catastrophe in Gaza and the West Bank. Thank you everyone for being here. Um, because of the wealth of expertise on the call, I will restrict my introduction to simply saying today we're going to be discussing perhaps the UNRWA, a long-term objective of the occupation, one that's gotten a greater impetus, I think, since the ICJ ruling against Israel. And secondly, second aspect that we'll discuss is the continued closure of the Rafah border crossing, the desperate need for aid, um, um, and that will be enough for today, I think. If I read out the list of speakers in the order in which they'll speak, I'll do it twice, and if anybody would like to perhaps change the order for whatever reason, just signal, and we'll arrange that. To speak first, Professor Dan Kovalik, who teaches international human rights law at the University of Pittsburgh's School of Law. After Ibrahim Saeed Noah, excuse me if I mispronounced the last name there, who's the chairperson of the Malaysian Parliament's Caucus for Palestine. Third, Sarah Flounders, co-director of the International Action Centre, who I believe has just returned from Rafah. Fourth, Dr. Lex Tackenberg, who's a senior advisor with Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. Fifth, Alicia Koutseliaris, communications director for Partners for Palestine. Chris Gunness, the former chief spokesperson for UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. Colin Cooper, a member of Scottish Friends of Palestine, excuse me. Dr. Ali Fuat, excuse me, my Turkish is non-existent, Gökçe, professor of political science, I believe in Istanbul University. After Dr. Gökçe, Richard Boyd Barrett, who's a deputy in the Irish Parliament with People Before Profit. Paul Murphy, also a deputy in the Irish Parliament with People Before Profit. And then finally, the chairperson of AOHR, Mohammed Jamil. I'll wait for any signal that people might want to change that order. And in that case, Dan, please, after you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. As a international law professor, I want to focus on the international law implications of both the closing of the Rafah crossing as well as the unprecedented cutting off of assistance to UNRWA. There's a number of things implicated here, of course. I mean, even before you get to the ICJ case, you have international humanitarian law is represented in such conventions as the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Convention of 1907. All of them require that during war, not only that civilians are off limits for being attacked, that in fact all parties have to take all measures to protect civilians and to ensure that they get the necessities of life, like water, food, medicine. To do the opposite, to cut off these life-saving items, which is what is happening through the measures I've just discussed and others, is without more an international humanitarian law violation. So Egypt's in violation of international humanitarian law by cutting off the Rafah crossing, of course. Israel, to the extent they are participating in that, is as well. And I would say that all the countries that are cutting off aid to UNRWA are violating international humanitarian law. They should be doing the opposite. They should be taking great efforts to ensure that civilians are protected and get life-saving material. But now, after the ICJ decision, which specifically ordered Israel to take measures, again, as they are required under international humanitarian law, to provide, to make sure that the people of Gaza are receiving the things necessary to exist and live, again, water, food, medicine, electricity. The fact that literally within hours, these Western countries, in the face of that decision, decided to cut off aid to UNRWA is just not only despicable from a moral position, but it's in violation of the ICJ decision, which, by the way, all legal experts agree is binding on all parties, not just Israel. Every country has to abide by that. And by the way, every country has to abide by the Genocide Convention. Article 1 makes it clear that all states must do everything in their power to prevent and stop genocides. And again, to then participate in the genocidal campaign by cutting off the main lifeline, and UNRWA is the main lifeline of the Palestinian people in Gaza. To do that during this conflict, again, violates Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, violates the ICJ decision, and violates international humanitarian law. These are all very clear, and I think these are the things we need to say and use to put pressure on the parties to reverse this decision. As you know, UNRWA has announced that if aid is not restored by the end of this month, they will have to end all their activities. I mean, that's an incredible thing. That would not only hurt the people in Gaza, it would hurt the people in the West Bank and in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria. So it's a very serious situation. I hope this was helpful, and I do hope someone takes more affirmative measures to reverse these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was just a perfect way to begin. Our next speaker, Mr. Syed Noah. Please, after you.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening or good morning here in Malaysia. It's about 1:09 a.m. Fellow speakers and guests, viewers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me in this webinar. I think it is a very crucial time where the UN Secretary General has warned that the world is entering into an age of chaos, a dangerous and unpredictable free-for-all with total impunity. And where even after ICJ's interim ruling and provisional measures were announced, Israel's military assaults escalated in Gaza, from Khan Yunis to Rafah, from airstrikes, sniper shots to imminent ground military invasion. And the UN SecGen said such an action would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. So from the onset, I would like to state the obvious. That is, the current situation in Gaza may be the making of Nakba 2.0, where Palestinians are violently displaced, dispossessed, massacred, targeted, along with destruction of towns, hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, refugee camps, etc. If the scheme of things persists, then the expulsion of Palestinians may be far more than during the Nakba in 1948. That is about more than 1.5 million Palestinians in Rafah. And the situation is further aggravated by the fact that UNRWA funding has been suspended. UNRWA provides Palestinian refugees with humanitarian aids, education, health, and social services in, as mentioned earlier by Dan, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, as well as in Jordan, Lebanon, and also Syria. And this, therefore, subsequently will result in catastrophic risk of starvation and famine amid an already humanitarian disaster, especially in Gaza. Probably you have heard about this. Felipe Lazzarini, the UNRWA chief, said, "It is immensely irresponsible to sanction an agency and an entire community it serves because of allegations of criminal acts against some individuals, especially at a time of war, displacement, and political crisis in the region." And a Palestinian American writer posted this question as well. Why didn't the US apply the same standard and withdraw its military aid and funding of Israeli war crimes after the World Court's interim ruling determined the possibility of genocide by the Israeli state? How hypocritical is it that the Biden administration reacts to Israeli allegations by instantly cutting off funding to the UN aid agency, but does absolutely nothing at all after the ICJ orders Israel to abide by the Genocide Convention and stop killing Palestinians? I think one cannot stop but believe the scheme of things by Israel and its allies on this. Could revenge for the ICJ's interim ruling against Israel be the real motive behind the demonization of UNRWA and collective punishment of Palestinians by defunding an agency that employs nearly 33,000 employees, workers, and delivers critical aid to Palestinian refugees? This is a big question. And I recall in December, Israeli media reported the government was conspiring to push UNRWA out of the Gaza Strip after the war, including by trying to tie the agency's activities to Hamas. And Human Rights Watch accused Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war. So, ladies and gentlemen, in actual fact, the targeting of UNRWA and the international aid cuts which followed are aligned with Israel's long-running interests in removing the organization from the equation of Israel's military occupation and the issue of Palestinian refugees. So therefore, in accordance with ICJ's rulings for immediate and effective action to ensure the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, in the light of catastrophic risk of starvation and famine of Palestinians, in the name of humanity, we must first urge countries who have suspended their funding to reconsider their decisions and reverse these funding suspensions, uphold their duties, and scale up humanitarian assistance for civilians, especially in Gaza. Do not be complicit in the use of starvation as a weapon of war. Secondly, the Arab world and states must step up to fill quickly the unconscionable gap inflicted by the Western countries by contributing funds to UNRWA from their multi-billion dollars of oil revenues. Thirdly, we must intensify international pressure to Israel and its allies based on the ICJ rulings to negotiate for a ceasefire by organizing people's rally and raise voice of the people to their leaders in the country. Number 4, we must demand the UN Security Council to pass a resolution on the enforcement of ICJ's ruling. The Security Council, although there are arguments about it, the Security Councils have the power to take punitive action against Israel. There were past examples of this, including economic or trade sanctions, armed embargoes, and travel bans. Number 5, we must pressure US, Western, and the other allies to stop providing military assistance or components to Israel, as such acts only tantamount to genocide and crimes against humanity, and therefore against ICJ's rulings. And we must take the pressure to Israel to comply with ICJ rulings by initiating case at the ICC. And lastly, we must also amplify the voice of conscience and humanity as the narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I believe Palestinians in Gaza may have been displaced repeatedly. They have nowhere to go, but their great-grandfathers were born there. Their grandfathers were born there. Their fathers were born there. They were born there, and they will remain there. They remain resistant. They have a right to resist. And there will never be a Nakba 2.0 with whatever assistance we can give. And I believe in the end, our narrative must be clear. That is, in the case of the Palestinian-Israeli war, the core issue revolves around achieving political independence for Palestine and ending colonial status. It is a struggle for humanity, human rights, justice, freedom, and sovereignty. And therefore, it is crucial that we ensure that Rafah crossing will not be closed, that humanitarian assistance must be provided to the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, and that UNRWA would be able to continue on with their assistance. So that's it, basically. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim, especially for those six powerful demands. I will just have to beg your patience for 30 seconds when I explain why there are no Palestinian speakers, so far as I know, on the panel. The AOHR, as long platformed, will continue to platform Palestinian speakers in Gaza, in the West Bank, amongst the diaspora. But I'm sure you understand that many of our Palestinian friends at the moment are, preoccupied, for want of a better word, and therefore I think it's proper that those of us around the world who are in solidarity with the Palestinian people speak with them. Yeah, and with that being said, Sarah Flanders, after you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers of this event. And I'm so glad speaking after the last two speakers, because really we do need to see this in terms of the right to resist, both in Gaza, but internationally, everywhere around the world. Solidarity and support with Palestine means resisting this age of chaos, this acting with absolute impunity, lawlessness, criminal activity. The ICJ ruling, so important, from South Africa. And let's look at the response of the Biden administration in league with all of the imperialist allies. I want to first say just a word on Rafah crossing, which as this was like step one, you could say, in the efforts to strangle and force Gaza into submission. And it failed, but it is a deadly, deadly process. There have been sanctions on Gaza for 17 years, ever since Hamas won the elections. These were UN sponsored elections, and their winning of it, the US and Israel both imposed really grievous sanctions on Gaza. Of course, it reached a whole new proportion in terms with the Israeli attacks and occupation after the October 7th military operation. But very important to see, and the complicity of Egypt also in the strangulation of Gaza, the complicity in terms of there are hundreds and hundreds of trucks. They stretch for miles at Rafah crossing, waiting to get into Gaza, and they are intentionally blocked. Now, Egypt is part of that. The U.S. is absolutely part of it. They set up this onerous condition as part of Camp David years ago. Every truck that goes to Rafah has to go 50 miles further to an Israeli base, be completely unloaded, box by box, piece by piece, scanned, sniffed, all kinds of things, and then go back and be searched again. It's an impossible, onerous procedure, and it's gone on for a long time. But if we're talking about the ICJ ruling, really, which called for an end to Israel's genocidal killing and an end to the blockade of food and water and fuel, of medicine to Gaza, the immediate response of the Biden administration to this World Court ruling was to do the opposite. The immediate response was to embrace Israel's unsubstantiated charges against UNRWA and cut off all funding to the vital supplies of all Palestinian refugees in Gaza, yes, and in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria. It was an all-out act of war against the entire Palestinian people. That's the response. And the even initial response to the ICJ was a White House statement that said, it's meaningless. It's meaningless. And this is how they're operating. Today, international law is meaningless. We can see in the bombing of Iraq and Syria and Yemen that even the US Constitution, absolutely meaningless. The act of war against the Palestinian people is receiving total support from US, from Britain, from EU members, the NATO members, complete support, and support even on this totally fictitious charge against UNRWA. So what do we do here in the face of international lawlessness? I do think it's important, essential to support and spread the ICJ rulings and actions, but to call on the US and call everywhere in the world to suspend all weapons and all financial transfers to Israel. This is a very time when, in terms of the IDF conduct, they are targeting UN and UNRWA personnel. 150 UNRWA members literally executed. So we have to demand an end to deploying this armada of warships to the area that is targeting the resistance. It's essential to call for the funding of UNRWA, that they provide the critical aid, education, healthcare in Gaza since 1950. And it's by far the biggest and most essential organization sustaining life. I'm very much part of an effort that went to Egypt, to Cairo in November, December. There have been several other efforts trying to focus attention on the Rafah crossing. But now I think we're really those efforts were met with only repression and arrests and so on. But now we're really in a new dimension with the expansion of bombing into the region, into Iraq and Syria and Yemen. Here was an action taken by the Ansarullah movement that led to not one death. If ever there was an action that only impacted profit, and that is the act of war. That's the reason there is a bombing of Yemen today. Their solidarity with Palestine, but also they are impacting Western corporate profits. So calling for an end to the bombing of Yemen and the bombing of Iraq and of Syria is an essential part, I think, of our responsibility. So thank you to the organizers of today. I think our response is in the streets, it's in the courts, it's in the media, and it's knowing that we are up against really widening and far more dangerous war. They are absolutely determined to defend the Israeli settler state and to defend their strategic ally, their outpost in the region that has always stood for racism and apartheid and war. And they seem determined to do it. But the people of the world at this point are stronger than they've ever been. Our collective voice is stronger, and we need to find new and creative ways in terms of impacting in every court, in every parliament. Supporting these efforts is important, but in the streets is also an essential place to be. In the blocking of ports and railroads, we want to support those actions legally and politically and with our feet. So there's no one action today that can be taken. I think it is an embrace of resistance and making collective demands, listening and supporting each other, and promoting all of these as widely as we can. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, especially for emphasizing the importance of a popular initiative. Next, we have Chris Gunnis. I should say again, the former chief spokesperson for UNRWA. Chris, please.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor for me, actually, I have to say, to speak after Dan and Siad and Sarah, who've spoken so eloquently, I think. It's quite humbling. I am a mere spokesman, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, full disclosure. I thought the thing that I could perhaps add to this very rich mix of a conversation is some observations from an UNRWA perspective, because although I am the former spokesperson, I am, of course, very much in touch with my former colleagues. UNRWA and its mission remains, well, it was a very big part of my life, and it remains a very big part of the values and the mission that I really stand for. So indulge me. I'd like, I think, to make 2 points. First of all, to make some observations about the dossier, the Israeli security dossier, which was the trigger for what is essentially the biggest existential crisis in the history of UNRWA. It, as you know, was leaked or put out within 24 hours of the ICJ's ruling on provisional measures. And I think nobody would be surprised to know that this was quite clearly a piece of news manipulation. It was an accusation, it was allegations, there was no evidence. And I have got hold of a copy of this, and I can assure you all, and I'm very happy to send it to any of you, that it is a series of allegations involving names of people which in May 2023 were handed over to the Israelis by UNRWA itself, because it might surprise some of you to know that every year, as part of its due diligence and its commitment to its zero tolerance policy to neutrality violations, UNRWA can only work in the places it does if it is absolutely copper-bottomed and watertight in its implementation of the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality. So UNRWA handed over the entire staff list in digital form. It had been checked against the Security Council's terrorism list. And Israel didn't actually even respond or thank UNRWA for the list. But neither did it come back to UNRWA and say that it had any reservations about any of the individuals on this list. It was only the day after the ICJ ruling that all of this came out. Now, there is evidence that, if true, would perhaps be not even circumstantial. UNRWA, and now former UNRWA staff, I should say, because the Commissioner General summarily dismissed them before either the internal investigation done by the Office of Internal Oversight in New York or the external one headed by a former French minister. Barely had they started their investigations, but in order to protect the interests of the agency, which is permissible under the frameworks that are there for staff management, Philippe Lazzarini decided to dismiss these people. Now, the journalists, I think, saw that not as a sign of UNRWA's zero tolerance policy, but as an admission of guilt. Now, of course, it was far from that. It was robust and it was resolute and it was swift action to demonstrate to the donor community and others that UNRWA was committed to the policy of neutrality. However, what we saw was the donors, led by the Americans and also the Brits, without any real confirmation. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, actually said on the record, we have not been able independently to verify this information, but we find it very credible and we're going to defund UNRWA. You know, you have to connect the logical parts of that sentence. They haven't actually been able to confirm and corroborate the evidence, and yet they're going to take this action, and neither have they incidentally told UNRWA what it has to do to bring the donors back and to have this aid suspension reversed. Neither has it explained to UNRWA what the strategy was. If the donors, now 18 as a group, had come to say, look, we're all going to defund it, here's why we're doing it, then that might have made some practical policy sense. Instead, what one can only really conclude from the lack of those things is what we're seeing is a political attack on UNRWA and its mandate. Now, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist, just Google what Benjamin Netanyahu has said. He has said he wants UNRWA dismantled. He wants UNRWA defunded. Now, we all know that it's the dream of the Israeli far right to dismantle UNRWA. It has been for many years. I was a spokesman for UNRWA from 2007 to beginning of 2020, 14 years. Almost as soon as I got there, I was facing these political attacks on the agency. And it's quite clear that there's a belief that if you get rid of UNRWA, the agency looking after up to 6 million refugees, then suddenly these refugees and their right of return magically disappear. Now, that is a bit like saying that if you get rid of Oxfam, you get rid of poor people. It is utterly absurd. And it is also flies in the face of what the Universal Declaration is based on. These are human beings, these up to 6 million people with inalienable rights. collective and individual rights, including the right to self-determination. So no Israeli far-right cabinet minister or prime minister or coalition can wish that away. The other part of the so-called dodgy dossier, I'm calling it the dodgy dossier because this has now become slammed into the narrative. I think we can all accept it was. The usual suspects were part of all this. So UN Watch, which is an organization that has put out false information consistently about UNRWA, Impact SE, another one of these groups, there are quite a lot of them, and they fed in to this dodgy dossier, and some of them actually went to Congress and were testifying there. So there's a whole network, if you like, of misinformation that is fed on this, and unfortunately the donors have taken this hook, line, and sinker. I mean, I was saying to a group earlier today, we've now seen these pictures, these Abu Ghraib style pictures of Israeli soldiers humiliating naked Palestinians, standing over them in these humiliating fashion. Does the American government say this is typical of what we know the IDF to be, and therefore we're going to defund them? No, they judge, the Americans will judge the IDF on the reaction to that. And what I'm saying about UNRWA is give UNRWA the same chance. You know, judge UNRWA according to what it does. And what UNRWA has done is resolutely dismiss these people before there's any proven evidence against them. And I think the second broad point I'd like to make, because it hasn't been touched by any of the speakers so far, and that is this notion of abolishing UNRWA. And it's really a practical point I want to make. Let's supposing right now I abolished UNRWA. Of course, UNRWA's mandate is handed down by the General Assembly. UNRWA is a subsidiary organ, so-called, and gets its mandate. So nobody but the General Assembly can actually abolish UNRWA. But let's suppose that it's defunded and it doesn't exist. If the job of those 13,000 staff, which I would say is essential and life-saving in the present circumstances, is to be met by this new organization, first of all, the agencies which are there, WHO, UNICEF, OCHA, and all these others, they have a handful of people in Gaza. So they would have to, this new entity would have to advertise in websites and local newspapers, go figure. There would then be probably over 1 million job applicants because unemployment in Gaza is 79% and rising. The HR department of this new agency would have to go through, 1 million job applications. They'd then have to do the first interview, the second interview. They'd have to do onboarding, security, screening. Oh, and by the way, UNRWA pays its staff the lowest you can imagine. So if this new entity were going to pay the going wage of, say, UNICEF, this would become more expensive. The point I'm making is that UNRWA and its life-saving work now cannot be abolished unless you're an armchair humanitarian sitting around in Tel Aviv or Washington or London. It is impossible. And in any case, what we're seeing now is mass starvation taking hold. The World Food Programme has made, the World Health Organization has made it clear that at least 400,000 people are facing starvation. Starvation is a massacre in slow motion, and that slow motion massacre has begun. Food aid is really more, it's not like a light bulb you can turn on and off, it's more like a locomotive. And if you slam the brakes on a locomotive, it carries on down the tracks. So the starvation that is in the pipeline will continue even if we slam the brakes on now. And that's why I'm saying to the donors, they need to get on the right side of the law. As Dan has quite rightly said, he has pointed out the illegality, the fact that it's a violation of the provisional measures of international humanitarian law, of the Genocide Convention. It's an immoral act, it's disproportionate, and it's punitive. And I would finally like to say, if you would indulge me, what has happened is that the news management has unraveled. And what is dawning now is donor embarrassment. Because the donors, it's going to become clear, let me assure you, in the coming hours and coming days, that the donors have swallowed an Israeli lie that was put out as a piece of news information. And I would suggest that just as the donors are calling for an investigation into UNRWA, I would like to see an investigation into donor neutrality. They have weaponized UNRWA doing Israel's bidding. I would like to know what mechanisms and frameworks these donors have in their capitals for ring-fencing humanitarian decision-making from politics. Because just as UNRWA, I know for a fact, will show the donors, transparently that it is implementing these neutrality frameworks, which it has developed itself in partnership with these self-same donors over the years. Just a few years ago, the GAO, the Government Auditing Office of the United States, did a root and branch audit of UNRWA, gave it largely a clean bill of health, and the aid, 350 million, carried on. Okay, so maybe in the light of 7th of October, people feel they need to reinvent the wheel. But let me assure you that those frameworks are there. UNRWA is committed to those frameworks, but we want to know what the donors are doing in order to ring-fence humanitarian decision-making from politics, because that's something I think which must come out of this regrettable episode. In the meantime, the donors should immediately unsuspend aid, and if at the end of the internal UN inquiry at the highest level, OIOS in New York, and the external inquiry, any wrongdoing is established, then let's have a conversation about imposing sanctions upon UNRWA. Until that moment, that immoral and illegal decision to defund UNRWA must be reversed. Thank you all very much.
And thank you very much, Chris, for that fascinating insider account. There's a lot that I didn't know myself. Before we proceed with the speakers, I've been told that we have a comment from Ansia. Ansia, if you're with us, please, off to you.
Thank you so
A couple
much.
of minutes, if you don't mind.
Yes, it is just such an honor, of course, to be part of this. I just wanted to highlight one thing about the ICJ decision, which is that even the Israeli juror, Judge Ahran Barak, voted in favor of humanitarian assistance and stopping incitement to genocide in the initial ruling on provisional measures. So the decision of numerous Western countries to block aid based on what we now know are unsubstantiated allegations is probably the epitome of what is just a cruel irony. And the suspension of UNRWA funding does jeopardize humanitarian efforts and would undermine the right of return, which has been recognized by UN Resolution 194. So yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. We're about halfway through. If I could just remind the speakers to come that between 5 and 7 minutes is the preferred time, allowing us to have a discussion afterwards. And on that note, if I could invite Dr. Lex Tackenberg to speak.
Yes,
Lex?
thank you
Yes, hello.
can you hear me? Yes, thank you for having me and for the opportunity to contribute to a fascinating discussion. And I very much thank also the previous speakers, including my former colleague Chris, with whom I worked for many years before my current role with ARDD, Jordanian NGO. I also worked for a long time with UNRWA, including a decade in the Gaza Strip, and I thought, building on what Chris said, I make a brief comment about sort of placing the recent development, the recent sort of attack on UNRWA, in sort of a historical context of the relationship between Israel and UNRWA, between UNRWA and Israel. During the first 20 years of UNRWA's establishment, the agency had very little dealings with Israel, because the Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt and all aid came in through Egypt, and the West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and administratively the operations in the West Bank were also administered through Jordan, and supplies would come in that way. This changed, of course, dramatically already during the Six-Day War, and already on the second or third day, Israel explicitly requested UNRWA to continue its operations, and it only took a matter of days to work out an exchange of letter, a written agreement referred to as the Michaelmore Agreement to regulate the continued assistance of the continued assistance by UNRWA to the Palestinian refugee population in Gaza and the West Bank. Now, since that time, so UNRWA is there and continues to be there at the explicit request of Israel. At the same time, it has been a complicated relationship, a kind of hatred-love relationship. On the one hand, Israel realized full well that as an occupying power, if UNRWA were not there, it would have the obligation to provide humanitarian services to the refugee community, as Israel did until the establishment of the Palestinian Authority for the non-refugee population in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. On the other hand, UNRWA was different from other UN agencies in that 99.9% of its personnel are Palestinian refugees themselves, or otherwise nationals of the host countries where the agency operates. And in that sense, it did not see sort of UNRWA as a real international organization. So it saw it more as a Palestinian organization with sort of a minimal international oversight. So that's one reason why Israel has sort of dealt with UNRWA with a continued suspicion. It also quite rapidly discovered that UNRWA was sort of the soft underbelly of the UN system, that if you wanted to criticize the UN, you didn't have to go to criticize New York or the principal organs of the UN. You could criticize UNRWA, as it has frequently done. You know, the current situation that we see, and Chris referred also to earlier instances. I mean, it has been cyclical. Every now and then, when Israel felt the need to deflect attention away from, negative attention on its conduct away in different directions, it has frequently resorted to criticizing the agency. Criticizing neutrality, criticizing social media postings by its employees, criticizing the use of textbook in the schools, and so forth. So that has been one reason for Israel to sort of both an easy target and a useful tool to sort of deflect attention, and again, Chris already mentioned it. It was no coincidence with this latest incident or with this latest assault that happened hours after the ICJ ruling. Well, another sort of reason why Israel frequently challenges the agency, or continuously challenges the agency, that's also where the right-wing criticism comes in, is that UNRWA was created shortly after the UN General Assembly determined that the refugee solution should be found primarily through return. The infamous Resolution 194 of December 48, sort of determining that. UNRWA was created a year later, when the Conciliation Commission for Palestine, headed by the US, realized that this return was not likely to happen, and that more focus on local integration in host countries should be made, and that was something that almost from the beginning host countries and refugees themselves were suspicious about, especially when 15 years later the Conciliation Commission for Palestine became defunct. UNRWA did not step into the vacuum to sort of advocate for return and potentially other durable solutions, and the Palestinians became the only category of forced displaced without an agency seeking durable solutions to their plight. And in that vacuum, in that protection gap, the very existence of UNRWA became a symbol for the right of return, for the unresolved permanent international responsibility of the international community, for the unresolved question of Palestine. And that's why the refugees attach so much to UNRWA, not only as a service institution providing critical services, but also as a symbol of their unresolved plight. And that's why Israel, on the other hand, realizing that this is the case, wants to close the agency down. So ideally, they would want another agency to provide these services that is not sort of connected to the right of return, and sort of in that way, sort of do away with the international responsibility to still find a just and durable solution to the refugees' plight. And as Chris said, even if you do away with UNRWA, the right of return flows not from Resolution 194, it flows from the illegality of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So even if you would do away with Resolution 194, if you would do away with UNRWA, the refugees continue to have their rights and will continue to fight for their rights and to assert their rights. Let me leave it at that. Happy to answer questions during the conversation.
Thank you very much, Lex, in particular for mentioning the right return for refugees, which I think is central to the issue. Next, Alicia Kutsalieris, forgive my pronunciation. Alicia, if you're with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again for the invitation to participate this afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone. So I don't know how much more I could add following the other speakers, but just want to emphasize that what happened on October 7th was not the beginning of something. It was definitely the reaction to something. The ongoing blockade that has been crippling the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip for 17 years, and the ongoing occupation in the occupied West Bank for well over 5 decades. So this was their a reaction to the oppression that the Palestinians have been feeling. And the rhetoric that the Israeli government has the right to defend itself is very misleading for those who don't understand or follow international law. There is nowhere in international law that says an occupying power has the right to defend itself. More so, it's the population that is being occupied would have more of a legal right to defend themselves. This is not to justify the actions that happened on October 7th. Of course, any loss of life is tragic, whether it be civilian or soldiers. But the Palestinians have been facing crippling restrictions on every aspect of their life for decades, and now they are facing even more tragic circumstances in the past several months since October 7th. Organizations such as Amnesty International have reported that the Israeli government will use mathematical formulas to dictate how much aid, as far as food and water, is allowed into the Gaza Strip for survival, not for the civilians to live and thrive, but just for survival purposes. So now, since October 7th, restricting that along with medical aid and turning off the electricity and allowing free availability to the internet to get messaging out. All of this being restricted is much worse since October 7th. So then to cut off what is basically the lifeline for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in the form of the aid that's coming from UNRWA is just it's inhumane. It is a form of collective punishment, which we also know is is against international humanitarian law. We are fighting, the Israeli government is basically using this as a form of a collective punishment. There's no military solution with cutting off aid as far as food and water. There's no military objective for these atrocities. It is just a form of inflicting the maximum amount of pain and suffering to the men, women, and unfortunately, the children of Gaza. So for what we do here in the United States, specifically for Partners for Palestine, we are a nonprofit organization in the state of Florida that promotes education and advocacy. And what we are trying to do is to educate our community members on the history of the region, why what's happening is happening, and the international law. Because we have found that that the information that we're getting through the Western media is not only inaccurate, but it is lacking appropriate information. So what our organization does is makes it a point to educate our community. Then they can go out and speak to their elected officials, inform them that this is not how we want to be represented on the world stage. And we know that the United States does have the ability to move the needle on this conflict. The Palestinians are facing a very slow and tragic genocide. The United States is one of several nations that provide more than half of UNRWA's budget. So to stop that, to pause that funding is going to be detrimental. What we should be focusing on is stopping the funding of arms going into the region, because we know that we have documented proof that U.S. weapons have been used by the Israeli government in both the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank. So what we want to do is to get our citizens in the offices of elected officials and let them know that we do know what is happening. We do have the correct information. Thanks to social media, we're allowed to see what's happening in real time as it unfolds live on a day-to-day basis. And if those elected officials are not willing to do the right thing and support the Palestinian civilians that have been suffering, we will vote for somebody who will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I've just been told that Richard Barrett and Paul Murphy are both deputies for People for Profit in the Irish Parliament have been called away and on other business, and instead they provided videos or a video for us to watch. So that being said, if next Dr. Ali Fuat Gökçek could speak, after him Colin Cooper, then we'll watch the comrades' videos from, and then we'll have a brief round of comments, questions, and so on.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Yes, thank you, Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes, Mr. President, dear participants, I greet you all with respect. Today, we will focus our discussions on the situation in Gaza, paying particular attention to the difficult circumstances its citizens face. We will examine the situation, ongoing challenges and complexities, and explore possible paths towards a resolution that promotes peace and stability in the region. In Gaza, the gates were closed and bombs were dropped, killing tens of thousands of people since October 7. We have spoken on television and gave statements to newspapers, but we could not stop these attacks. Genocide and urbanicide. Yes, two terms, genocide and urbanicide. Genocide is crimes against humanity have been committed in Gaza since October 7 until today. Also, urbanicide is humanity crimes. And then it's committed in Gaza since October 7 until today. How long will the world remain silent about this situation? Genocide. What is genocide? We know genocide is the killing of civilians, unarmed people, women, and children. However, there is also the destruction of the cities in Gaza. Every city has historical, cultural, religious, social, and spiritual culture. In the cities of Gaza, mosques, churches, hospitals, and historical places are completely demolished, severing the city's ties with the past. How long will this continue? With your permission, I would like to explain the Israel-Palestinian war in a broader context. Let us remember, with this support of the USA, normalization agreements were signed between the Gulf countries and Israel to ensure Israel's security in the region. However, this was not enough for Israel's security, since the Gulf countries were states affiliated with global capital and the USA. No threat was expected from those countries. The main thing was to prevent the anti-Israel policies of Iran and Iran-supported groups. Meanwhile, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Yemen resolved their problems. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates applied to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. At the same time, these countries joined the BRICS. All these developments were unacceptable for the USA. Again, BRICS members trading among themselves in national currencies was perceived as a blow to the US dollar. Thinking that People's Republic of China caused all these developments, the USA announced the India, Middle East, Europe trade route at the G20 summit held in India in 2023 to unite Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, which were breaking away from it around its axis. The USA implemented a similar policy for the continental Europe. Macron's statements about NATO and his efforts to ensure the security of European Union have created concerns that continental European countries will break away from the US axis. To consolidate the continental European countries again, the USA invented the Russian-Ukraine war, revealing the Russian threat. The same tactic is also applied to Gulf countries. The India, Middle East, Europe trade route is from Bombay, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and via the ports of Israel to the Eastern Mediterranean and to Europe. On this route, only the area between Gaza and the West Bank was deemed unsafe for global capital. Hamas in Gaza Strip was seen as a threat to this route, and global capital has already made a decision to eliminate this threat. Political scientist Wright Mills states that USA has three elite groups: economic, military, and political. He explains the relationship of these elites, which eat each other as an inverted pyramid, while the economic elites at the top. These determine the goals. The military elites make plans of these goals, and political elites implement these plans. This trait rose in a policy planned by military elites in line with the goals of global capital elites. The implementers of this policy are the US political elite and Israel politics and army. Even if Hamas didn't attack Israel on October 7, Israel would later attack Gaza and take the Gaza Strip under its control. Hamas' attack almost became an accuse. Israel's excessive counterattack continues. However, Israel didn't expect Hamas and Palestinians to show this much resistance. Other countries that support Israel, especially the USA, didn't expect this resistance. He thought that Israel would soon take control of Gaza Strip and send the Palestinians toward Egypt. But this plan didn't work. The Israeli army failed in urban battle and suffered heavy losses in Gaza cities. Rafah border gate was closed. The failure of the Israeli army created disappointment both in its public and in the United States and other countries that supported it. The Israeli people began to pressure the Netanyahu government to release the hostages. US politicians made some statements in order not to be further complicit in crimes against humanity, but it wasn't enough. The United Nations and Arab League held meetings. No results were obtained. Brief ceasefire were made. Aid supplies were sent to the people of Gaza during these short ceasefire periods. The priority in this war is to ensure a permanent ceasefire and deliver emergency medical supplies and food to the people of Gaza. The only place for this is Rafah border gate. This door must remain open and secure. The international community must no longer remain silent. Muslims and Muslims organizations all over the world and people of other sensitive countries who can put a stop to this war must work together. The genocide committed in Gaza needs to be explained to everyone. In the Israel-Palestinian issue, not only Muslims, but all societies need to act together and take steps for world peace and political friendship. Otherwise, the traumas experienced will be transferred to the future generation and cause violence to occur in the future periods. Today, children whose
Sorry to
families
interrupt,
are...
Dr.
Yes.
Dr. Gotcha. If you have 1 minute left.
Yes, okay, 1 minute. Today, children whose families are destroyed and mothers and fathers whose children are murdered will pass on the pain they experience to the future generation. Isn't the reason for the violence occurring today the result of traumas experienced in the past? Yes, I have to come to the end of my presentation. I want to thank the organization committee for giving me this opportunity. As a final word, I invite sensitive people to act together for a better future. King regards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that incredible wide optic that you brought to the situation. Our last speaker, Colin Cooper, sorry for keeping you waiting. You have the floor. Hey, Colin. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Not? Okay, let's try again.
We are hearing you.
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a very distinguished panel. I sense that the value of this meeting will be in discussion, so my contribution will be extremely short. My background is medicine. I have some expertise in the past in anesthesia and managing trauma in a war situation. I have a knowledge of pediatrics and that whole area, which is obviously the area that I think this group might be able to make some comment on. I don't want to go over the absolutely pivotal role that UNRWA has made. It's been vital for all of the things that bear on a child's life, its education, and in the medical context, obviously, that's goes without saying. What I want to briefly add is we have a specific agenda of things to talk about, and we've hammered the same nail on the head over and over again, and that's good. We know where we're going, but I think it is the future that I want this group to look at a little carefully. It is the children of Gaza that are going to be the biggest problem. Dealing with their trauma will take massive resources over a very extended period. And somehow, even though we're focusing on the here and now, we need to look to that and how that can possibly be managed. I think it will be the thing, is the legacy of this war, is what happens to those children. The other area I want to talk about, which has not been mentioned, is I live in Scotland. It's a long way away from the Middle East. But of course, around the world, in small countries like Scotland, Gaza is very much a topic. And it is clearly, our reaction can only be a reaction to the media that we receive. And we know that the way the media is used around the world is extraordinarily variable. And I think a previous speaker has commented on misinformation. I think somehow we must be on our guard to try to fathom when we're being fed inaccurate information, particularly the story of the defunding of UNRWA and the reasons for it, are an illustration of that danger if we don't do that carefully. The final small point, well, actually it's not small, it was mentioned by the previous speaker. Just as I think the legacy of this war will be the harm to children and how we deal with it, the other incredible harm in Gaza is cultural. There are mosques, there are churches, there are holy sites that have been destroyed. One of the ways of any occupying power is to destroy the memory of culture in the country that they're trying to disable. We must in some way try to make sure that resources are given so that Gaza and Palestinians can not lose their culture. It's a vital part of the recovery phase. And true to my word, I'm going to stop now because I think the drama of this afternoon will be in discussions between us. But just to say, let's at least think about children and their future, and let's think about how can we salvage the culture which is in danger of being destroyed. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Colin, for all of those points. We do indeed have 10 minutes for discussion now. After which, I'm told the videos from the comrades from the Irish Parliament will be available. 10 minutes only, I'm afraid. There's so much to say. I wonder if anybody has a question, comment on the for another speaker. There's a raise your hand function at the bottom of the app.
It's Chris here, if I may. I can't make my raise hand function work. Please forgive my ineptitude.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask Dan if he's still with us. We're going to be getting Israel reporting back allegedly within a month of the 26th of January on measures it has taken or steps it has taken to implement the provisional measures. I mean, broadly speaking, there are two options. You know, one, they're complying, one, they're not. There's sort of grey area in between. What options does the court have, and what advice would Dan give for those of us engaging in public advocacy, particularly media advocacy, like myself? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think Dan has left the call for another one, I believe. I don't myself have an answer to that. I wonder if Lex, you do. I should also add that R's hand is raised. R.
I can briefly come in.
Please.
I don't have the full answer. I'm not an expert on sort of the procedural aspects of the workings of the International Court of Justice, but my understanding is that the progress report by Israel is a public document which would also be pro forma shared by the registrar of the court with the Security Council. So it would sort of depend partly on the Security Council in case there is a situation of non-compliance or partial non-compliance, partial compliance, as to potential actions. Theoretically, it's also possible for South Africa to sort of go back to the court and raise sort of serious non-compliance. I mean, I think the reporting is monthly. So imagine if after 3 months there is still no basic compliance. I mean, South Africa may get back to the court with requesting further interim measures. I've also seen that Nicaragua, there was just a press statement by the ICJ as the webinar is taking place, that it has requested to intervene, and specifically with respect to a number of states allegedly complicit in the prima facie, the plausible case of genocide that the ICJ has established in its interim order. So there are different ways of sort of turning or using sort of the progress report as a measure for compliance with the report. Once again, I'm not an expert, so I would also love to hear the commentary of those that are really familiar with the workings of the ICJ in detail.
Thank you very much, both. R or the man, your hand still raised. Please feel free to ask a question, give a comment. Okay. In that case, the truth is everybody we asked to speak is just so busy. It's the busiest of times for everybody. People have got on. If I can suggest we move to the videos.
As the world knows and can see in front of its own eyes, the people of Gaza for 4 months now have suffered the most unspeakable horror. They are living the nightmare of a genocidal attack by Israel that has led to the murder of 27,000 Palestinians in Gaza, 2 million people displaced, and the entire population now threatened with famine, being denied clean water, electricity, shelter, the things that are necessary to sustain human existence. We are witnessing a textbook example of genocide. And all of this is being allowed because of the support that the United States, Britain, Germany and other European powers within the European Union are giving to Israel, to this apartheid state, this colonial state, this genocidal state. that for decades, since 1948, has been committing crimes against humanity against the Palestinian people. The crimes of ethnic cleansing, the crimes of apartheid, the crime of a brutal, cruel occupation. And now, even after the horror that we have witnessed over the last 4 months, Israel threatens to make the situation even worse, talking about intensifying its attacks in Rafah, the last refuge of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who fled for safety, who were told to move south where they would be safe, and then were bombed again and are now being threatened in their final place of refuge. And also we have the United States, Germany and other countries defunding UNRWA, an organisation that provides vital aid, healthcare, education to millions of people in Gaza and millions of other Palestinian refugees. So in front of the eyes of the world, Israel, that is committing a genocide, threatens to make that genocide even worse. And this comes after South Africa take the brave and heroic decision to put Israel into the International Court of Justice for the crime of genocide. So, the moral credibility of Western governments that can allow this horror to continue is absolutely gone. They are complicit. The United States, Britain, the European Union, and many other states that fail to act to stop this genocide, to stop this nightmare and horror, or to threaten to defund UNRWA, or allow Israel to intensify its attacks in Rafah, show that they have not a shred of moral or political credibility left. But we can take hope from the action of South Africa, a country that itself suffered decades and decades of colonialism and apartheid, but eventually rose up against that apartheid regime, resisted that regime, and along with an international movement of boycott and sanctions and divestment, eventually that horrific, obnoxious apartheid regime in South Africa was dismantled. The same here in Ireland, where we suffered hundreds of years of colonialism, of apartheid, of brutal oppression at the hands of Britain. The resistance of Irish people eventually led to those colonial structures being dismantled. And that can and must happen for the people of Gaza and for the people of Palestine. Now, as witnesses to the genocidal horror that Israel intends to even further intensify, the world has to rise up against this regime, demand that it is fully dismantled. And we must rise up against governments in the United States, in Britain and the European Union to demand that sanctions are imposed, that they end their complicity with the regime that is capable of committing these horrific crimes, the worst possible crime, the crime of genocide, which has been committed against the people of Gaza and Palestine. But even in this dark hour that the people of Gaza and Palestine face, we can take hope from the actions of South Africa and from the millions, the tens of millions of people across the world who take to the streets week after week after week, standing in solidarity with the people of Palestine and putting pressure on their governments, demanding that sanctions are finally imposed on this colonial and apartheid regime. So we must redouble our efforts for the people of Gaza, for the people of Palestine, and for all of humanity.
To say again, that was a PD in the Irish Parliament, Richard Boyd Mallet, who's a representative for the Progressive Party People Before Profit. So thanks to him from afar. We've got one question, R's question. What action can we take to help now? What is to be done, as has been asked before. I've got some ideas myself. I wonder if Colin, Alicia, Chris, you, Lex, too, you have an answer.
I mean, I have some thoughts if nobody else does. I can see Colin. Colin, you go before me, please. You need to unmute, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just to say, the drama and then the horrors that we're seeing at the moment, it will seem a cruel and unbelievable statement, but compassion fatigue will set in. And in Scotland, we are nowhere near the level of concern expressed by the contributor from Ireland. We have to try to find a way of the active groups spreading into the wider community. And one of the biggest dangers in a country like Scotland is that the Balfour Declaration is not taught in any school. The universities are shackled by IHRA legislation. Somehow we have to get beyond our silos of special interest. And I'm not entirely sure how that can be done. If anyone can send advice on how we can engage the wider corporate managers of our country, the government for one, and the churches, they're all in Scotland, frankly, almost mute. So any ideas?
Chris, after you.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a very specific thing, and it sort of in a way follows on from what Colin was saying about, what do we do? And the decision to defund UNRWA is very opaque, and nobody knows what the basis of this was. So 18 donors have just defunded to the tune of about $500 million. And as a result of that, which, as we've heard in this discussion, is illegal. It's a violation of international humanitarian law. It's a violation of the provisional ruling of the ICJ, and it's a violation of the Genocide Convention. Most of those 18 are state parties. I would like to hear the donors put under the microscope, and I would like to get some questions asked in national parliaments. I've actually written to my MP. She's a pretty useless Tory, I have to be truthful and say, and I didn't even get a reply. But I would like us all to push with our elected representatives to start asking questions in national parliaments and elsewhere about what did our governments know and when did they know it? On what basis was a decision taken that could lead to an illegal decision taken that could lead to mass starvation? Because that is what we're facing. And we need to hold these donor governments to account. We need to have some transparency and some accountability, and some parliamentary questions are a start. I don't know how far we'll get, but I certainly want to know what Andrew Mitchell, the UK Development Minister, knew. When did he know it, and on what basis did he make his decision? I think we could all start asking those questions of our elected representatives. That's just a small piece of action I think we can all engage with. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much. And unless someone else would like to hazard an answer for R, I think we'll leave it there for today. I want to again take the opportunity to thank all our speakers, thank members of the audience.
One moment. Actually, we have another recorded speech from Paul Murphy. He is also a member of Irish Parliament. If you please, we can play it now.
Sure. Please, after you.
My name's Paul Murphy. I'm a Member of Parliament in Ireland for People Before Profit. I'm very sorry that I can't be there live today, but the organisers asked me to share some thoughts about the situation, the horror faced by the people of Gaza. Obviously, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is a deliberate punishment, really a criminal punishment of ordinary Palestinian people, men, women, and children on the ground, punishment by cutting funding for UNRWA, and I think that is punishment in response to Israel's genocide being called out on the world stage. It is a response to the case taken by South Africa at the International Court of Justice, and it's a response really to the preliminary findings of that International Court of Justice. So this, global alliance of Western imperialism, the biggest terrorists in the world who support Israel, have decided we're going to punish those who rely on aid. Over 2 million people in Gaza rely on the aid provided by UNRWA. They are now faced with even deepening horror, devastation than what they have faced over the last more than 3 months at this stage. And the threat of famine, widespread starvation, of disease is massively exacerbated by this criminal decision. And the Irish government, thankfully, has not cut funding. It has criticised the decision to cut funding. But we in the opposition, as socialists, are of course pushing them to go much further, to call out and actively oppose what Israel is doing, to call out and actively oppose the US support for what Israel is doing, and to argue at a European level for sanctions to be imposed, for Israel to be kicked out of the EU-Israel association agreement, to bring that agreement, which gives preferential access to Israeli goods into Europe, to an end. I think, the agenda of the Israeli establishment is absolutely revealed by Netanyahu's response to the proposal for a 135-day ceasefire, describing the idea of such a ceasefire as delusional. So the reason he thinks it's delusional is because the Israeli establishment want to continue the war, want to continue the onslaught for as long as they feel is necessary to inflict as much terror as possible into the ordinary Palestinians, and to complete the new Nakba that they are effectively trying to impose now, to drive Palestinian people out of the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Desert. That's their war aims, and they've openly declared it. That was the very damaging thing for the Israeli side at the International Court of Justice. Of course, Israel could not be doing what they're doing now without the support of Western imperialism, without the support of the US in particular. We know every year $3 or $4 billion is given in military aid to Israel, but this year the Biden administration is trying to push through more than additional $10 billion of military aid. Without the support of US imperialism, the occupation could not continue, the apartheid could not continue, the whole Israeli regime could not continue. So therefore, it's a key demand of the movement in Ireland to call this out, not to, in particular, there's a St. Patrick's Day is the National Irish Day, and every St. Patrick's Day, the Irish Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, goes to visit the US President, hands over a bowl of shamrock. It's kind of an opportunity for US presidents to curry favor with Irish Americans, particularly important for Joe Biden, who likes to speak about his Irish roots, and particularly important in the context of the election that Joe Biden is facing. So it's a very widespread demand now of the movement in Ireland that we have raised repeatedly in the Parliament, in the media, etc., to call on the Irish government to say, we will not go to Washington on St. Patrick's Day. We will not be giving shamrocks to genocide Joe Biden. We won't be allowing him to use the kind of shine of Irishness for his own political benefit, as long as the US administration is supporting and financing a genocide that is currently happening in Gaza. So there's very broad support for that idea that they should not be going, no shamrocks for genocide Joe. Of course, the Irish government at the moment is continuing to do what they have done from the very, very start, which is to balance or attempt to balance between the demands from below, from ordinary people for solidarity with Palestinians, and balance that with keeping good relations with US imperialism. I mean, they allow the US Army to send millions of troops through Shannon Airport to the Middle East. They consider this to be a very important relationship and so on. So the movement is gathering pace to say, do not go to the Irish government. It's also demanding the same of all the political parties. For example, the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald, who has said, unfortunately now, that she will go. We're saying, and the movement is saying, don't go. Don't be giving shamrocks. Don't be giving again, the sheen of Irishness to Joe Biden, and we must not stand by while the US is supporting this genocide and is absolutely complicit in it. So there are key things that we are fighting for, because I think the only way we'll be able to have a just, a lasting peace is on the basis of justice. And internationally, we have to build as strong a movement for Palestinian solidarity as possible. That means pressuring the Israeli regime to stop what it's doing, but it also means pressurizing our own governments to speak out clearly and to take clear actions.
Yeah, thank you to Paul Murphy for that powerful message, and to People for Profit as an organisation, great organisation on the Irish Parliament. Unless anyone has a final comment or remark, I think perhaps we'll leave it there. Again, thanks to all our speakers, thanks to the audience members. The organisation, AOHR UK, does these events now on a fortnightly basis, and we always publish the proceedings afterwards. We, of course, encourage our speakers to contact each other. If you would like anybody's email, please contact us. And with that, with thanks again, it's good evening from me.
Thank you very much for everyone. Good night.